A number of comments to the videos on my Norinco Hunter Galil style conversion have indicated I didn't do a very good job explaining how I made the receiver block. Part of this was my fault, obviously. I wasn't able to set up a camera near my belt grinder to get good footage of the actual modifications, and I didn't show much of the other stuff because of my injured finger. But essentially this is what this video is going to go over. To start with, the components are the ACE AK-47 receiver block. You can see sort of sticking out the back here. It's the one designed for stamped receivers, but once again I've modified it to be able to be used with the Norinco Hunter. And there are also these Galil panels, the G10 variety. Galil is a phenolic resin that's reinforced with a fibrous material of some sort. The G10 is glass reinforced. I believe it's G11 that's fire resistant. The point is I just had some 1/8-inch thick stuff laying around that I used to use as knife scales. Also there are these 1032 dome head screws that I use to hold on the Galil, as well as provide a sling attachment point, as you can see under here. And finally, the last component is JB weld, which you see is down here and fills in the gap, probably about a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch on the bottom. I used it to stick on the Galil panels before I drilled and tapped for the 1032 screws. Now these drawings that I'm going to show you are not specifically to scale, they're not schematics. You're going to need to do your own measuring just to make sure that things fit, or just even test fit to make sure that the block will fit inside the receiver without a problem. But starting at the top, the grinding we're going to be doing is going to be done along the sides, and this is going to be the area highlighted in pink. Once again, I don't know how much needs to be taken off. Your best bet is to measure the interior of the receiver and the exterior of the block to make sure that they coincide. You can do this by test fitting or by taking before and after measurements if you've got a mill or some other precise way of removing material. But once it is ground down, it'll start looking like this with the bare metal along the sides. You test fit it back inside the receiver and measure the angle of this triangle left between the rear of the rifle's receiver and the front edge of the back of the block. You're going to transfer that angle onto your panel material and cut out 2 panels, one for each side. Now the panel itself can be just about any sort of solid material. I used Galil, which is a form of reinforced plastic. You could also use metal. You could even use wood. Just something that is strong enough to fit in there. Most of the strain is going to be taken up by the block, not the panels themselves, but any sort of residual stresses may be transferred to them. One thing to be sure of is to keep the bottom a little clear. Make sure it extends past the bottom of the receiver, and that's going to become important in the next step. Before I inserted the now ground up receiver block back into the rifle for the last part of the fitting of the Galil panels, what I did was I coated the inside of the receiver and the outside for about 1/2 inch with some release agent. I use Johnson's paste wax. There are a number of other release agents there to be used, but the inside of the receiver, the outside, including the bottom, because the bottom is what we're going to fill with the JB weld. So I used the JB weld to stick the Galil panels in place on both sides, just clamped them in place up against the rifle. Then on the bottom here, make sure you can see that. Come on, get some light. There we are. Filled this in with JB weld. You can see there are a couple vacancies where there were air bubbles in the epoxy mix. But once it's ground flush and then painted over, you can't even see where the transition is. So I think JB weld works well as a metal filler. Not as great as an adhesive, but for this purpose it's going to be just fine. The final operation is just to sand flush both the panels and the JB weld filler, so that they are flush with each other, flush with the back edge of the receiver block. This is something done off the rifle, which is why it's important to apply a release agent. There may be some of the receiver left exposed, and that's fine. It would have been exposed anyway with the normal factory style stock. And the last step of the process would then be just to paint the block. As I mentioned, I painted the JB weld and it matched very nicely with the receiver block itself. Can't see that because the handle's in the way, sorry. Can't see that because there's no light on it. But anyway, that worked very well. What I did was I masked off the Galil because I wanted it to stand out. I thought it was going to be greener than it is. Turns out it's not as green. as I would have liked it, but I'm going to leave it like that. If you were redoing the finish of the rifle with a spray-on finish, it would match pretty well. You'd still have the line, of course. It's not a welded transition there, so you're always going to have some bit of a little gap. But it worked out very nicely, and so far it's been very solid.